Hello everybody! Today we're going to talk about session 18, so let's go ahead and get started. I am Ra. I greet you in the love and the light of the infinite creator. We communicate now. Questioner. I was thinking last night that if I were in the place of Ra at this time, the first distortion of the law of one might cause me to mix some erroneous data with the true information that I was transmitting to this group. Do you do this? I am Ra. We do not intentionally do this. However, there will be confusion. The errors which have occurred due to the occasional variation in the vibrational complex of this instrument due to its ingestion of a chemical substance. It is not our intent in this particular project to create erroneous information, but to express in the confining ambiance of your language system the feeling of the infinite mystery of the one creation in its infinite and intelligent unity. So here we have Dawn reacting to the errors that Ra pointed out from the last session, and the errors that Dawn found Ra saying in the last session, and had the thought, well, maybe these errors are intentional. Maybe there are some untruths mixed in with all of these truths to keep us on our toes so that we don't have everything revealed to us all at once. And Ra says, no, that's not an intentional part of this project. It has to do with Carla taking the LSD, which is what they then say in the next question and answer. Dawn asks, can you tell me what the chemical substance is that was ingested causes poor contact? I am Ra. This is not a clear query. Could you please restate? Questioner. You just stated that you had some problems with the instrument because of the ingestion by the instrument of some chemical substance. Can you tell me what the substance was? I am Ra. The substance of which we speak is called vibratory sound complex, LSD. It does not give poor contact if it is used in conjunction with the contact. The difficulty of this particular substance is that there is, shall we say, a very dramatic drop-off of the effect of this substance. In each case, this instrument began the session with the distortion towards extreme vital energy which this substance produces. However, this entity was, during the session, at the point where this substance no longer was in sufficient strength to amplify the entity's abilities to express vital energy. Thus, first the phenomenon of, shall we say, a spotty contact, and then, as the instrument relies again upon its own vibrational complexes of vital energy, the vital energy being in this case very low, it became necessary to abruptly cut off communication in order to preserve and nurture the instrument. This particular chemical substance is both helpful and unhelpful in these contacts for the causes given. So, in the Book 5 material, Carla says that Dawn did not know that she had taken the LSD, that it was a secret that she kept from Dawn because she knew Dawn would not approve of that secret. And so here Ra is essentially tattling on Carla for having done this. And Ra says that, LSD can be helpful in channeling if you use it intentionally to channel. And mind you, I'm not advocating doing this. I don't think it's actually a good idea to try to do that. I think you would have to be very established with a group and have magical protection and all the same stuff that you need to have a successful channeling contact. I don't think LSD is just going to make a successful channeling contact arrive. I think you could definitely contact the wrong beings if you just go into it very unprepared. But that Carla was at the end of her trip, at the end of her dose, it was wearing off, and this caused problems in the contact. And also in the Book 5 information for this session, Carla talks about how she didn't actually trip. She didn't have hallucinations. She just had a very strong sense of rightness and oneness, and if it was a beautiful experience for her. It was very pleasant. So she actually did it twice. And she was very happy that she got to do that. She hasn't had many opportunities with very hard drugs, she says. And that was the first time that she had that opportunity. But we will find out later that the LSD was planned by the negative entities who are trying to disrupt the Ra contact. And ultimately, these 2 doses of LSD that she did back to back will make her ill. will make her very weak and make it a lot harder to do the raw contact, because essentially she spent well above and beyond the normal amount of vital energy that she actually has. The LSD gives you the vital energy, but it was more like it gave her so much vital energy that she wore out her physical energy and depleted all of her native vital energy that she had. So then in this recovery from the LSD, she's going to be sick here for a while because of the LSD. And Ra will get into the issues with the LSD in a future session. But Carla took the LSD, and Ra says it can be helpful for channeling because it really increases the vital energy, but when it drops off, it cuts off that supply and it makes the contact spotty. And so that's what happened, and why Ra transmitted some errors in the previous session when Carla was coming off of her LSD. So yeah, here Dawn again was asking because these errors occurred, wanted to know the mechanism of these errors, and Ra said it was the LSD Carla took that she didn't tell you about because she knew you wouldn't approve of it. And Carla does say that she has no regrets, that it was a good time for her and she really enjoyed it. And looking at the entirety of the raw contact zoomed out in a way that, from my vantage point, in a way that she maybe couldn't have done, it does seem like the LSD caused a lot of problems that if she hadn't taken it, wouldn't have occurred. But she has no regrets, so she had a good time with her LSD. So in 18.4, Dawn asks, are there any foods that are helpful or harmful that the instrument might eat? I am Ra. This instrument has body complex distortion towards ill health, in the distortion direction corrected best by ingestion of the foodstuffs of your grains and your vegetables, as you call them. However, this is extremely unimportant when regarded as an aid with equality to other aids, such as attitude, which this instrument has in abundance. It, however, aids the vital energies of this instrument with less distortion towards ill health, to ingest foodstuffs in the above manner, with the occasional ingestion of what you call your meats, due to the instrument's need to lessen the distortion towards low vital energy. So here we have Ra advising Carla to take care with her diet, and here they're saying it isn't as important as her attitude, which is positive and helps her out, but it is a factor to her vital energy. I believe the reason that they said her ingesting the correct food isn't as important as maintaining her attitude, because Carla really actually loved food a lot. Food was very important to her, and she did especially love to eat meat. And we do find out later on that Carla is essentially allergic to meat, and she really needs to eat fresh caught or fresh hunted meat, not farmed meat, because farmed meat has many, many, many more distortions, and these distortions caused a reaction in Carla's physical body. So here Ra does emphasize the ingestion of grains and vegetables and only meat as needed, but Carla believed that she needed meat with every meal, or at least every single day. And so I believe this balancing of diet and mental configuration is something very important to consider, because I think sometimes we change our diet in a way that feels like self-flagellation, like we're punishing ourselves for our previous gluttony, and we're then trying to counter that by restricting our food intake in a way that we feel is more appropriate. But ultimately, if you're bummed out because of the ways that you choose to change what you're consuming, that's going to cause problems on another level. So your attitude about what you eat is at least as important as what you eat. And Ra does say later, too, that often if we have ill health, that a change in diet is a component towards alleviating that ill health, because we need to consume foods that show respect for ourselves. So diet is a very complex and important thing for maintaining our body complex, and how we react to what we eat psychologically is very important too. So it's a really big topic, and we will talk more about it. Dawn asks more questions in regards to food and Carla specifically throughout the whole contact, because here Ra is bringing it up or Dawn does ask, but I'm pretty sure here in the outro of this section too, Ra does emphasize that the diet is important because Dawn brought it up, so now they have the opening to say, yes, Carla needs to focus on what she eats and to do it in a constructive manner, I suppose. One of the big problems being, I believe I mentioned before, that Dawn, when Carla used to cook, Carla loved cooking. And at one point, Carla had gotten like all of his mother's old recipes and would make food for him, all of his favorite childhood meals, and he started to gain weight. And that was unacceptable to him. So he essentially banned Carla from cooking in the kitchen because he didn't want to overeat. And especially by this time that Jim gets here, Jim ends up being the cook, and Jim is not a creative cook. He's a functional cook. He made sure that they were fed, but I think they also ate out at restaurants quite a bit, which I do think contributes to a lower quality of food being eaten. Just from my own personal experience, I've worked in restaurants for like 14 years of my life. The food gets older there before it gets eaten. It waits around for a long time sometimes, but we will continue to talk about this more in the future. So next we have 18.5, and Dawn says, "Thank you. I have a question here from Jim that I will read verbatim. Much of the mystic tradition of seeking on earth holds that belief that the individual self must be erased or obliterated, and the material world ignored for an entity to reach nirvana, as it's called, or enlightenment. What is the proper role of the individual self and its worldly activities in aiding an entity to grow more into the law of one?" I am Ra. The proper role of the entity is in this density to experience all things desired, to then analyze, understand, and accept these experiences, distilling from them the love light within them. Nothing shall be overcome. That which is not needed falls away. The orientation develops due to analysis of desire. These desires become more and more distorted towards conscious application of love light as the entity furnishes itself with distilled experience. We have found it to be inappropriate in the extreme to encourage the overcoming of any desires, except to suggest the imagination rather than the carrying out in the physical plane, as you call it, of those desires not consonant with the law of one, this preserving the primal distortion of free will. The reason it is unwise to overcome is that overcoming is an unbalanced action, creating difficulties in balancing in the time-space continuum. Overcoming thus creates the further environment for holding on to that which apparently has been overcome. All things are acceptable in the proper time for each entity, and in experiencing, in understanding, in accepting, in then sharing with other selves, the appropriate description shall be moving away from distortions of one kind to distortions of another, which may be more consonant with the law of one. It is, shall we say, a shortcut to simply ignore or overcome any desire. It must be understood and accepted. This takes patience and experience, which can be analyzed with care, with compassion for self and for other self. So this is a nice big answer from Ra again, and it's comparing the ideas of Eastern religions, of the kind of dissociation that is encouraged by Eastern religions, and saying that that is not really the best way to process catalyst in third density. In third density, we really need to be getting our hands dirty and really, really learning and experiencing the things that we've come here to experience. To just totally detach from the lessons that are available in third density creates imbalance, because then you're not learning the lessons that you came to learn. You're going to have to build up another lifetime, another life experience to come back and to process those lessons if you're just detaching from those lessons or suppressing your desires. Because really the only way we truly experience and learn is to feel and experience these things through our body. And emotions are an important part of that. And our society in general encourages the suppression of emotions, which is why I think that a lot of Eastern religious practices are appealing in that way, because it sort of formalizes that process. instead of makes it a subconscious thing that society encourages us to do, to just detach and ignore our emotional body. So essentially here, what Ra is saying is that as an entity becomes conscious of their need to work and do this spiritual work, the desire becomes more and more distorted towards conscious application of love light. And so as you make that your conscious desire, your experiences will start to fall in line with that, and you'll be given the opportunities to choose the conscious application of love and light and release the distortions that are less consonant with the law of one. And this is just an automatic process that happens if you make that choice. Like Ross says, the act of will to seek the love in the moment is, the first time you do that is the cornerstone. And then every time you do it afterwards, it doubles upon that intention. So you're building that momentum towards really recognizing the conscious application of love light. And as you do that, the other distortions fall away. And I think probably everyone who has been on this path of accelerating their evolution of consciousness has had that experience where they recognize and realize, oh, this distortion that I was experiencing, these thought forms that I didn't really want to engage with, or these behaviors that I didn't want to engage with, all of a sudden, that desire to engage with those is gone. But that process doesn't happen via suppression. That process doesn't happen with shoving things down with shame and ignoring them, and instead always choosing to focus on the love and the light over what distortions you're actually experiencing. That's what we refer to as toxic positivity, or even spiritual bypassing. When you force the conscious distortion of seeking the love and the light on yourself without processing these distortions that aren't purely of the love light energy. And we all have them. Again, it's just being a human, being a part of this planet. We're bestowed these thought form distortions that we have work to do to process from our yellow race society. So there's lots and lots of work to do for all of us, lots of emotional processing. And, one thing that I remember reading from Quo is that we really set up a lot of things to unfold throughout our lifetime. And a lot of things are long-term projects for us to deal with. They aren't just quick fixes, because we want to experience the process of releasing these distortions. And we can't do that without feeling things in our energy body and then understanding our emotions and how they're applying to the different situations, different people, different things that we do to ourselves and to other people. It's just really, really important to dive in and let ourselves feel our feelings, regardless of what the situation is. Because, we have the mind, and everything happens in the mind. Everything comes from the mind. But it isn't until we manifest the things in our mind that we actually can then hold them in our hands and look at them, right? Like, I don't know how many times I've seen people say and had the experience, and I'm sure everyone else has had the experience. You can sit around and think about something, but then if you write it down, like you journal, you make a post on the internet, or even just talking to somebody about it. And here Ra even mentions that you're supposed to go through all of your experiences and then sharing it with other people. That manifests the thoughts that are in your head by speaking them out loud. That doesn't necessarily mean they're true. It just gives you something physical and tangible then to deal with. So allowing yourself to feel your emotions in regards to your thoughts, again, gives you something tangible for, Ross says that the body is an athanor. We're here to do experiments with this physical chemical body. And so taking thoughts out of our mind, writing them down, letting ourselves feel the emotions, this is a process of that experiment where we're refining then our emotional reactions to situations to understand those reactions. So that's why overcoming creates the environment for holding on to that which apparently has been overcome. You can, we all know the end result of the experiments. all is one, all is love light. That's the end result. We can not do the homework and we can just write down the answer if we want and have the right answer. However, at some point we want to do that homework. We want to do that work because that's really truly what's valuable for our spirit, our soul, our social memory complex. That's why we're here, is to have these experiences and to actually learn from them in our unique personal vibratory makeup, to process these experiences in a unique way instead of just skipping to the end. The more unique experiences that we create, the more we're allowing the infinity of the Creator to flourish and experience itself. So again, it's like I said, if Ra was to give us a very specific set of rules and teach learning that we could, or learn teaching that we could follow to gain enlightenment, then everyone would be following the same cookie cutter experience. But we're not here to do that. We're here to create new and unique experiences. We come in uniquely balanced energy bodies to feel all of these things, to experience all things desired, and then to process them. And some of these desires may be base desires, but if you're working in consciousness and developing your higher chakras and also allowing your lower chakras to have experiences and then processing those experiences, raising them up higher and higher through the chakras to understand them, that's just really the whole point. That's really what we're doing. And there's a lot of fulfillment on that path. So here Ra's saying that it's really important to experience all things desired, to trust that this is the experience that you're supposed to be having, and that your higher self, your sixth density social memory complex, or even like your own personal fragment of self needs to experience and process to create an overall balance. And that's one of the reasons too why Ra says that, there is no understanding in third density. It's confusion, and you just have to invoke faith that what you're going through is ultimately in the best interest of the self, even beyond your incarnational self. And then, Ra does say that, if you have a desire for things like violence, a desire for things that might harm other people, that's okay, because ultimately we're just animals who have moved into third density. We have a few other functions, right? We have some bells and whistles on top of our animal body that allow us to work with the spirit, but we still have all of these instinctual animal desires that we need to process. And some of those in third density look a lot scarier than they do in the animal kingdom, but they're still very normal. Again, the desire to harm others, that's an instinctual self-preservation drive, and it's normal. But Ra says that you shouldn't actually, to the best of your ability, infringe upon the free will of other people by harming them because your desire is to harm them. But it's okay to imagine these experiences. And I think a lot of our media is set up to allow us to have these sort of imaginative experiences of things that are not consonant with the law of one. So then we can sort of process them in a less direct way. We can still work with and process and feel those emotions vicariously without actually harming anybody. So free will is the free will of others. Preserving the free will of others is ultimately more important than experiencing all things desired. But if you do have to experience these things actually in the physical, again, it's all going to resolve itself in the end. It's all going to be okay in the end. I don't really want to say that it's okay for you to harm people, but I think what's really important is to not have shame for these desires, even if they manifest in action, because again, we are just animals with instinctual drives, and the whole point of being a human is learning to overcome those instinctual drives. But we have to understand them and accept them and integrate them before we can overcome them. If we just skip to the overcoming part, we haven't actually done that work, and it's still going to exist somewhere inside of us. So yeah, Ross says, All things are acceptable in the proper time for each entity, and in experiencing, in understanding, in accepting, and then sharing with other selves, the appropriate description shall be moving away from distortions of one kind to distortions of another, which may be more consonant with the law of one. So I really think that this sharing with other selves is an important part of this process here that Ra talks about. And again, I think it's just the manifestation of your thoughts, and so that you can look at them and then you can have a mirror reacting to your thoughts as well. Because if we aren't sharing with other selves our own experiences, we don't have that feedback that is very, very, very valuable. And I don't think you need that feedback all of the time, but I do think that feedback is helpful. And Ra also says, it is a shortcut to simply ignore or overcome any desire. It must instead be understood and accepted. This takes patience and experience, which can be analyzed with care, with compassion for self and for other self. So, again, like a lot of the lessons that Ra teaches, they take a long time. It isn't something that it's just going to happen without going through the process of experiencing. So always have compassion for yourself and patience, and recognize that, you have your whole incarnation to figure this out. It might be a while before certain things fall away, and that's okay too. It's especially okay if you're not infringing upon anybody's free will with your distortions that you're hoping to release and have fall away. And I think of things especially like addictions. As long as you're not harming anybody else, but, you want to stop drinking, or you want to stop smoking weed, or you want to stop these things. And sometimes it's harder than you expect. And going through the process of understanding why you're making this choice over and over again, and really feeling that, and really trying to have compassion for yourself, and trying to find some understanding. Like, that's the process. That process is far more useful than just telling yourself you're a bad person for doing this and using guilt and shame to get yourself to stop certain behaviors. Compassion and patience are way more useful in the long-term overall goals of what we're trying to do here. And I do think that the shame and the guilt, that's what Ra talks about too. Overcoming thus creates the further environment for holding on to that which apparently has been overcome. So I think that is a lot of the function of that guilt and shame, is because there is still some part of you that feels guilt and shame for the previous behaviors, instead of actually going through that painstaking process of really understanding why you're engaging in those behaviors, or why you desire to engage in those behaviors. So, a really important and interesting response from Ra. A lot of things to think about, and again, I think this kind of puts a lot on our plate, because it is easier to just kind of shove things away and not deal with them. But I think anything that you can put on your plate to deal with is it's useful. It's what we're here to do, to process all of our experiences in this way. So in 18.6, Dawn asks, basically, I would say that to infringe on the free will of another self or another entity would be the basic thing never to do under the law of one. Can you state any other breaking of the law of one than this basic rule? I am Ra. As one proceeds from the primal distortion of free will, one proceeds to the understanding of the focal points of intelligent energy which have created the intelligences or the ways of a particular mind-body-spirit complex in its environment, both what you would call natural and what you would call man-made. Thus, the distortions to be avoided are those which do not take into consideration the distortions of the focus of energy of love-light, or, shall we say, the logos of this particular sphere or density. These include the lack of understanding of the needs of the natural environment, the needs of other selves' mind-body-spirit complexes. These are many due to the various distortions of man-made complexes in which the intelligence and awareness of entities themselves have chosen a way of using the energies available. Thus, what would be an improper distortion with one entity is proper with another. We can suggest an attempt to become aware of the other self as self, and thus do that action which is needed by other self, understanding from the other self's intelligence and awareness. In many cases, this does not involve the breaking of the distortion of free will into a distortion or fragmentation called infringement. However, it is a delicate matter to be of service, and compassion, sensitivity, and an ability to empathize are helpful in avoiding the distortions of man-made intelligence and awareness. The area or arena called the societal complex is an arena in which there are no particular needs for care, for it is the prerogative, honor, duty of those in the particular planetary sphere to act according to its free will for the attempted aid of the social complex. Thus, you have two simple directives: awareness of the intelligent energy expressed in nature, awareness of the intelligent energy expressed in self to be shared when it seems appropriate by the entity with the social complex, and you have one infinitely subtle and various set of distortions of which you may be aware. That is, distortions with respect to self and other selves, not concerning free will, but concerning harmonious relationships and service to others as other selves would most benefit. So here we have another big answer from Ra with a lot of interesting points, so I will do my best to try to take this one apart. And so here Dawn's asking about free will and how infringing upon free will is the number one thing that you should never do. That's basically Dawn's question. And Ra actually has some caveats to this rule about free will infringement. I think basically in general, Ra is saying here that honoring free will is pretty tricky when you're trying to serve. And obviously you should definitely do your best to not infringe on others' free will. But the in-streaming energies that create our planet and the in-streaming energies created by us that also create our planet are very complicated and many-layered and create many different mind-body-spirit complexes. And so one thing Ra says that is when you're trying to serve, one of the best ways to do that is to use empathy and imagination to become aware of the other self as self. So essentially step into somebody else's shoes and see what they would want from service, because it isn't so simple as the golden rule, like treat others as you want to be treated, because there might be things that you think would be the proper way to be treated, but might then offend somebody else if you treated them that way. So if you can take the time to step into somebody's shoes, try to see things from their perspective, it makes it a lot easier and simple to hopefully try to serve them. And here Ra says, in many cases, this does not involve the breaking of the distortion of free will into a distortion or fragmentation called infringement. However, it is a delicate matter to be of service, and compassion, sensitivity, and an ability to empathize are helpful in avoiding the distortions of man-made intelligence and awareness. So when you're trying to serve from the highest point that you can serve, that might still register as an infringement upon somebody who is a little bit more distorted towards the man-made intelligences of our creation. I guess I can think of an example. We talk about it sometimes in my Discord. We have a prayer request channel in my Discord, and we really want to honor free will of prayer requests, because there are some people out there, like, from the highest vantage point, we're all just praying all the time. Unity is inevitable. Thinking good thoughts for other people is a good thing. However, there are people who would be offended to know that this Discord has a prayer group that is singling them out to pray for them. Do you know what I mean? People who have some religious trauma might see that as an infringement. And then there are times when prayer is an infringement, where if you're, like pray the gay away, this type of thing. Oh, I'll pray for you. Like really condescending, like when you're judging somebody and you're trying to let them know that you're appealing to God to forgive their sins or whatever, things like that. So that's a way you can infringe upon somebody's free will and not at the same time, I guess. It's such a tricky thing, and that's basically what Ra is saying here. I think one of the important things Ra says is that the area or arena called the societal complex is an arena in which there are no particular needs for care, for it is the prerogative / honor / duty of those in the particular planetary sphere to act according to its free will for the attempted aid of the social complex. So essentially, If you're acting from the yellow ray in a way that you believe is truly going to benefit the social complex, you get to do that. And that ultimately might infringe upon people's free will, but, and you shouldn't. Like, obviously, if you can recognize that it's a free will infringement, you shouldn't do that. But there are protections against the kind of karma that comes from that if you are genuinely trying to help all other beings with what you're doing. So, for instance, Ross says you should be dispassionate about your attempts to share the law of one, but I'm going to use it as an example because that's kind of what we're doing right now. To go and make a post on your Facebook and say, I just found this book. It's called The Law of One. It's really amazing. I love it so much. It's helped me so much. Here's a link. If anyone ever wants to talk about it, then, send me a message, okay? Doing something like that is not infringing upon anybody's free will because you're just doing your best to help the societal complex, and you have the right to do that. As a person on this planet, you get to act in the ways that you think can help the societal complex. Now, if you're in a conversation with your brother and you start talking about things and suddenly you can bring up the law of one and you start talking about the law of one and your brother is kind of resistant to hearing about it, but you keep then pushing and pushing and pushing to talk about it, which I think a lot of us have been in this kind of situation. We really want to feel heard and understood about this philosophy, and we think that it would be beneficial to specific people in our lives, and a lot of the times they're just not ready to hear it. If you keep pushing, this is an orange ray interaction where it's you and one other person, and you pushing them, that would be an infringement upon free will. But if you're in the yellow ray where you're not talking to anybody specific, you're just putting that out there for anyone to see. I think it's the same with a lot of activism. To do activism where you're trying to reach a broad amount of people, to trying to educate anyone who is ready to be educated without any sort of attachment to that, that's your honor duty prerogative, and you should do that if you feel called to do that. However, sitting your mom down and forcing her to listen to political views that she doesn't agree with because you think you're right, and getting frustrated because she doesn't agree with you, again, that's more of an orange ray situation. So if you have the desire, like I said, to do some sort of activism in the yellow ray, you should do that. That's a call to service within you. You're serving. The tricky thing is, like I said, even if you get a pass, essentially, on infringing upon free will, if you genuinely think that that's helpful. I think of what Ross says about Adolf Hitler. Ross says that Adolf Hitler wasn't able to polarize negatively enough to make Harvest because he genuinely thought what he was doing was for the betterment of humanity. He thought eugenics was going to make humans healthier and stronger and happier. And to polarize negatively, I think you have to have the intention of harm, the intention of separation, the conscious intention to manipulate and control people. Whereas someone like Hitler comes to this conclusion, it's a very distorted and wrong conclusion, but he wasn't able to build up enough negative polarity because he had this desire to help the societal complex. So just a tricky thing to think about. But honestly, if you do feel called to, like I said, I lump it under the heading of activism, because I think a lot of us have felt like activists in one way or another for one cause or another, and that's okay, and that's your honor duty prerogative, and you should do that. If you think educating the wider society about things that they're ignorant about can help alleviate the distortions of this society, the man-made intelligences that form our collective, then you should do that. And again, evaluate whether or not you're infringing upon free will by doing these things. But if you think it's right deep down within you, then do it. And don't feel like you're doing something spiritually wrong just by speaking out, just by trying to change things. Because I think a lot of the times we activate the There's a term called a thought-terminating cliche, and these are tools of mind control, essentially. And the Law of One has a lot of thought-terminating cliches, and Ra doesn't really use them as thought-terminating cliches unless Dawn is really off track with his thoughts. But a lot of people will try to control conversations by using thought-terminating cliches like, there are no mistakes. You might try to build awareness about something that you care about, and then someone comes at you with something like that. There are no mistakes. All is one. Everything will be one again someday. We're in fourth density. These are some of the thought-terminating cliches, because what it does is it just shuts down the conversation. It's an appeal to infinity, essentially, which isn't always bad, but when it's used to try to discourage people from taking action that makes them uncomfortable, that makes other people uncomfortable, then they'll use a thought-terminating cliche to try to get you out of that mindset of wanting to speak up about what you see as a wrong. So even in spiritual groups, spiritual circles, there are a lot of people who will try to dissuade you from this, what Ra says, aiding the societal complex with your own free will. And you can ignore them. You can agree with them if you want to. You can slide deeply into acceptance, but it's also okay to take action to try to help, to try to change things. Because our society does need help. Our society needs a lot of help. It needs people speaking up. There are still lots and lots of people who want to make harvest, who are struggling, who are on the cusp, and it might just be a well-timed social media post that plants a seed that allows them to work with the rest of their incarnation and get to a point where they'll reach harvest. You never know. So at the last thing that Ross says, so you have two simple directives: awareness of the intelligent energy expressed in nature, awareness of the intelligent energy expressed in self to be shared when it seems appropriate by the entity with the social complex, and you have one infinitely subtle and various set of distortions of which you may be aware. That is, distortions with respect to self and other selves, not concerning free will, but concerning harmonious relationships in service to others as other selves would most benefit. Okay, so that's, to me, all I can read in that is that sometimes free will is not as important as harmony. I think that's what Ra is actually saying there, is that harmony in service to others and benefiting other selves is more important than free will. And I do have an example. There is a Hatan channeling where Hatan says that they reached fourth density through forced sharing because resources got so skewed in their distribution that they essentially redistributed the wealth that existed on their planet so that all beings could benefit, and this allowed them the awareness to move into fourth density. And so we have that problem on our planet right now, obviously. The resources are heavily skewed into a few hands, and then the vast majority of all other humans are suffering from problems that could be alleviated with those resources. And so I'm wondering, I'm not saying that Ra is saying that we should redistribute the wealth of the billionaires, but I kind of think they are. And I personally struggle with this idea of the trolley problem, right? If there's one person who's infringing upon hundreds of thousands of people's free will, that one person is infringing upon a whole bunch of people's free will, then why is it not okay to pull the lever on the train track and infringe upon their free will so that others aren't being infringed upon? Does that make sense? Because to me, it's really hard. I know that thought might be a little too logical, but it still seems to me that infringing upon one person's free will is better than infringing upon everybody's free will. Anyway, I would suggest everyone go and read 1816 for themselves, see what they think Ra is saying, because I think this is a tricky thing, and it does kind of shock me here that Ra is saying, that free will isn't the most important thing, and that harmonious relationships and service to others as other selves would most benefit is actually more important than free will. But yeah, I would be happy to hear anyone else's thoughts on what you think about 18.6, because I can't read it any other way. So 18.7, Dawn asks, as an entity in this density grows from childhood, he becomes more aware of his responsibilities. Is there an age below which an entity is not responsible for his actions, or is he responsible from the time of birth? I am Ra. An entity incarnating upon the earth plane becomes conscious of self at a varying point in its time-space progress through the continuum. This may have a median, shall we say, of approximately 15 of your months. Some entities become conscious of self at a period closer to incarnation, some at a period farther from this event. In all cases, responsibility then becomes retroactive from that point backwards in the continuum, so that distortions are to be understood by the entity and dissolved as the entity learns. So, at a very young age, 15 months is very, very little. We gain awareness of ourself, and therefore we are responsible for our choices. And then at that point, we retroactively take responsibility for everything that we did before that time. And it's hard to think of like a 15-month-old baby having accumulated a significant amount of like negative karma that they have to work with, that they're responsible for, right? Because they're a baby. They have very simple needs and only in very simple ways of communicating them. But I think that is more about just the lessons, maybe not necessarily even the karma, but the experiences, because even as a baby, we might not remember these experiences, but they are still a part of us. So then we have to take responsibility for how those experiences may have affected us, maybe have traumatized us if we were treated poorly or had traumatic experiences. So we are responsible for our entire lives from birth forward, but there is a point sometime after birth where we actually become conscious of our ability to choose. And again, most people on this planet are incarnating with seniority of vibration. We have a bias within us of the choice from our previous lifetimes. So I guess that kicks in pretty early. In 18.8 then, Dawn says, then an entity, say 4 years old, would be totally responsible for any actions that were against or inharmonious with the law of one. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is correct. It may be noted that it has been arranged by your social complex structures that the newer entities to incarnation are to be provided with guides of a physical mind/body/spirit complex, thus being able to learn quickly what is consonant with the law of one. Questioner, who are these guides? I am Ra. The guides are what you call parents, teachers, and friends. So children usually have somebody in their life who can guide them to their path of service, whether it's service to self or service to others. It might be a teacher, it might be a grandparent. For me, my grandmother was the one who set the example for me of how to be, and I'm very grateful for her. And I have a 4-year-old, so it is a lot of work trying to honor the 4-year-old's free will. I do try to guide him to the best of my ability. He doesn't have a ton of really strict, rigid rules, but our rules are you have to be kind and you have to take care of your body, which is being kind to your body. So those are really the really hard and fast rules that I have for my kid. And there have been a couple times where he's argued with me and been like, I don't want to be kind. I'll be like, nope, that's not negotiable. And obviously, he's 4 and sometimes he does things when he's dysregulated that can be perceived as unkind, and I'm not just punishing him in his dysregulation when he acts in an unkind way, but when we're able to converse about these things, like he knows that those are the general rules. We are kind to others and we're kind to ourselves, and we do everything we can to make sure that we make those choices. At another point later, I'll just add here, because Ross says that basically the only important thing when you're raising a child are to help your child understand how you worship the Creator in your daily rituals. So meditation, prayer, whatever you do every single day. If you can get your child involved in that, then that's great. And also accepting them for who they are, just with complete unconditional acceptance, except with a hand guiding them towards service, towards their polarity. Because ultimately, again, the first time you make that choice is the cornerstone, and then every time after that, it doubles. So the younger you can start that process of building polarity, the better it is for your whole life experience. Because if you start very young, you're doubling for so long, way longer than most of us who have consciously realized the need to make this choice. If somebody is there to tell you, you need to make this choice, and encourages you to do that, that's very helpful. So we do a pivot, and in 1810, Don says, I see. The entity Aleister Crowley wrote, Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. He was obviously in understanding to some extent of the law of one. Where is this entity now? I am Ra. This entity is within your inner planes. This entity is in an healing process. Questioner. Did this entity then, even though he intellectually understood the law of one, misuse it and therefore have to go through this healing process? I am Ra. This entity became, may we use the vibration sound complex, overstimulated with the true nature of things. This overstimulation resulted in behavior that was beyond the conscious control of the entity. The entity thus, in many attempts to go through the process of balancing, as we have described the various energy centers beginning with the red ray and moving upwards, became somewhat overly impressed or caught up in this process and became alienated from other selves. This entity was positive. However, its journey was difficult due to the inability to use, synthesize, and harmonize the understandings of the desires of self so that it might have shared, in full compassion, with other selves. This entity thus became very unhealthy, as you may call it, in a spiritual complex manner, and it is necessary for those with this type of distortion towards inner pain to be nurtured in the inner planes until such an entity is capable of viewing the experiences again with the lack of distortion towards pain. So, I think about this one a lot. I think about the becoming overstimulated with the true nature of things. I've talked about that even already before, is that some people, if you don't ground yourself in your lower chakras and you get overly impressed or caught up with the process of engaging in the higher chakras, you can become very imbalanced and then have behavior that was beyond the conscious control of yourself. So that's what Ra is saying here. That's what happened to Aleister Crowley. I think it happens to quite a few people who find magic without the protections of like a group. Ross says that if you're doing white magic, you should have a group to support you because doing it alone is just dangerous. So Crowley then became very unhealthy in a spiritual complex manner, and he's healing in between lives, and apparently a good portion of that healing is just becoming able to look at your own incarnation, the choices that you made, the choices that you didn't make, because a lot of his behavior was beyond the conscious control of himself, that ultimately caused him pain. And so, I'm sure that'll happen on some level for all of us when we're reviewing our life experience. We're going to look at some of the choices we made, some of the things that we did, and cringe and be ashamed of our behavior. So Crowley's not somebody that I'm super familiar with, but I do know that he had a lot of sexual distortions that he felt were super important. I guess that's pretty much all I could say that I know about him. So, Ross says later that if you have sexual distortions and insatiable sexual appetite, this is because of lower chakra blockages. So he, instead of actually examining what was going on in those blockages, he continued to try to use sexual magic to gain higher awareness in his higher chakras, and this just created this mess in his energy body and in his spirit complex. So yes, Crowley had his finger on the pulse of something, but he wasn't able to really integrate all of the things that he was trying to practice and learn about metaphysics and magic and spirituality. And I think that's something that we should all be cautious about. And to remember to ground ourselves, to remember to integrate with the planet and the society on some level so that we can continue to do work that aids the societal complex to be able to be of service to others. Otherwise, we just get lost in our own world and so detached from the consensus reality that what we're doing isn't really serving very many people. So, in 18.12, Don says, "You stated yesterday that forgiveness is the eradicator of karma. I am assuming that balanced forgiveness for the full eradication of karma would require forgiveness not only of other selves, but forgiveness of self. Am I correct?" I am Ra. You are correct. We will briefly expand upon this understanding in order to clarify. Forgiveness of other self is forgiveness of self. An understanding of this insists upon full forgiveness upon the conscious level of self and other self, for they are one. A full forgiveness is thus impossible without the inclusion of self. So, to forgive to the point where you can heal your own karma, you really do have to recognize the oneness of all of creation. That anything that someone else did to you was ultimately you doing it to yourself. And so the forgiveness needs to go all the way around. It needs to be full circle. It needs to include both self and other self. And it's just good practice, too, to forgive the self, to recognize the self's complicity in whatever our catalyst is. Because we are choosing that. We are, on some level, even if it's subconscious, drawing these experiences to us for one reason or another. So, yeah, to eradicate your karma, forgiveness of self is necessary because you have to recognize that there are no other selves. There isn't somebody else doing this to you. It's you doing it to yourself. And that's okay, because we're all just here to experience things, and we're all here to eventually find that oneness. So this seems to me to be a higher lesson, because that conscious acknowledgement and recognition of all selves being the self is a hard one. But if you can get there and you can enact that kind of forgiveness, you can eliminate a lot of your karma. So, in 1813, Don says, "Thank you. A most important point to my way of thinking. You mentioned that there were a number of confederations. Do all serve the infinite creator in basically the same way, or do some specialize in some particular types of service?" I am Ra. All serve the one creator. There is nothing else to serve, for the creator is all that there is. It is impossible not to serve the creator. There are simply various distortions of this service. As in the confederation which works with your peoples, each confederation is a group of specialized individual social memory complexes, each doing that which it expresses to bring into manifestation. So here's an example of a thought-terminating cliche. It is impossible not to serve the creator, right? Okay, Ra's trying to make a bigger point to Don to expand his thinking, but somebody could say that in a way that tries to shut down the idea of trying to talk about service to others or service to self and making the choice. Because, to quote the great Rush, you can choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. You're still serving the creator, even if you haven't chosen a polarity, but ... You can't really go anywhere if you haven't made that choice. You can't really move along the path of evolution until you make that choice and try to embody that choice. But here, Ra is saying that all the confederations are a group of specialized individual social memory complexes, each doing that which it expresses to bring into manifestation. Again, kind of a non-answer from Ra to a relatively thoughtful question from Dawn, I think. But yeah, Ra's saying that it's hard to say that all confederations are doing the same thing. It's hard to compare because different loci of time, space, and space-time are going to need different types of service. So that service approaches infinity, I would assume, because there are so many different ways to serve the various portions of the creator. So I ultimately think that's Ra's point with this answer to Don's question. In 1814, Don asks, "Can you tell me how Yahweh communicated to Earth's people?" I am Ra. This is a somewhat complex question. The first communication was what you would call genetic. The second communication was the walking among your peoples to produce further genetic changes in consciousness. The third was a series of dialogues with chosen channels. So we already know from previous questions that Yahweh genetically manipulated the Martians when Yahweh brought them here 75,000 years ago. And I guess genetically manipulated the Martians isn't the right way of saying that. Yahweh genetically manipulated the available third density body complexes that were on Earth so that the Martians could incarnate into them and have more of the utilization of physical arrangement that is required for later third density work, whereas early third density work doesn't usually require the genetic changes that Yahweh made, but Yahweh wanted to give the Martians a bit of a head start on this next cycle of their experience. And then Yahweh also came among us and created genetic changes at a later time, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more here. And then the third communication was through a series of dialogues with chosen channels. So Yahweh has been channeled. The original Yahweh has been channeled. I'm sure fake Yahweh gets channeled all the time too. And Ra does say at some point that Yahweh, the original Yahweh, changed their name since the name Yahweh was co-opted. So it's doubtful that any channelings that go by Yahweh are actually Yahweh, because Yahweh doesn't identify as Yahweh anymore. So in 1815, Don asks, can you tell me what these genetic changes were and how they were brought about? I am Ra. Some of these genetic changes were in form similar to what you call the cloning process. Thus, entities incarnated in the image of Yahweh entities. The second was a contact of the nature you know as sexual, changing the mind-body-spirit complex through the natural means of the patterns of reproduction devised by the intelligent energy of your physical complex. So essentially when Yahweh brought the Martians here and altered the mind-body complexes that were here for them to use, before the Martian spirits were attached, Yahweh sort of cloned themselves into our third density. So I guess Ra is saying that we look a lot like what the Yahweh entities looked like in their third density. And then later they came actually as physical beings and reproduced with us sexually to create genetic changes via evolution. So cloning and evolution are the ways that Yahweh have altered our genetics. In 1816, Don asks, can you tell me specifically what they did in this case? I am Ra. We have answered this question. Please restate for further information. Questioner, can you tell me the difference between the sexual programming, let us say, prior to Yahweh's intervention and after intervention? I am Ra. This is a question which we can only answer by stating that intervention by genetic means is the same no matter what the source of this change. So, Don's going to try again. In 18.18, he asks, can you tell me Yahweh's purpose in making the genetic sexual changes? I am Ra. The purpose 75000 years ago, as you measure time, the changes subsequent to that time were of one purpose only, that to express in the mind-body complex those characteristics which would lead to further and more speedy development of the spirit complex. Questioner, how did these characteristics go about leading to the more spiritual development? I am Ra. The characteristics which were encouraged included sensitivity of all the physical senses to sharpen the experiences, and the strengthening of the mind complex in order to promote the ability to analyze these experiences. So, part of the genetic changes that Yahweh made were to just sensitize us, to make us more sensitive creatures. Thank you, Yahweh. But also to make us smarter, so that we could process the experiences that we did have. And then 1820, Don asks, when did Yahweh act to perform the genetic changes that Yahweh performed? I am Ra. The Yahweh group worked with those of the planet you call Mars 75,000 years ago in what you would call the cloning process. There are differences, but they lie in the future of your time-space continuum, and we cannot break the free will law of confusion. The 2600 approximately was the second time. We correct ourselves. 3600 approximately, the time of attempts by those of the Orion group during this cultural complex. This was a series of encounters in which the ones called Anak were impregnated with the new genetic coding by your physical complex means so that the organisms would be larger and stronger. So 3,600 years ago is when Orion was able to make their biggest inroads by impersonating Yahweh in our social memory complex. So Yahweh, to try to mitigate that, came as the Anak and sexually reproduced with humans to introduce more genetic material that would allow humans to be larger and stronger. And when Ra says that there are differences in the cloning process that lie in the future of our time-space continuum and they cannot break the free will law of confusion, I have no idea what that means. What do they even mean? That there are differences genetically that will occur in the future because of what Yahweh did in the past? Do we have like genetic time bombs, ticking bombs in our DNA? I don't know. But Yahweh came as the Anak, giants, as the lore goes, and gave us new genetic material to try to combat the Orion infiltration. So in 1821, Don asks, why did they want larger and stronger organisms? And Ra says, the ones of Yahweh were attempting to create an understanding of the law of one by creating mind-body complexes capable of grasping the law of one. The experiment was a decided failure from the view of the desired distortions, due to the fact that rather than assimilating the law of one, it was a great temptation to consider the so-called social complex or subcomplex as elite or different and better than other selves, this one of the techniques of service to self. So, Yahweh tried to make changes that would allow us to grasp the law of one more easily, but instead we decided to embrace those changes as making a subculture who was bigger and stronger and therefore better than all other beings who did not have these genetic changes put upon them. So it was a failure. This second, at least I think both interventions by Yahweh were a failure, because the first intervention is what required the quarantine to be put on our planet at the very beginning of our third density, because these original changes were an infringement. And then Yahweh came, made more changes in our genetics, and this also was a failure and just caused more negative distortions than positive distortions. Sorry, Yahweh. Yahweh had good intentions, but the road to hell, right? So in 1822, Don says, then the Orion group. I'm not quite sure that I understand this. Do you mean that the Orion group produced this larger body complex to create an elite, so that the law of one could be applied in what we call the negative sense? I am Ra. This is incorrect. The entities of Yahweh were responsible for this procedure in isolated cases as experiments in combating the Orion group. However, the Orion group were able to use this distortion of mind-body complex to inculcate the thoughts of the elite rather than concentrations upon the learning teaching of oneness. So again, here, Don was confused, but Ra's saying, that Yahweh wanted these changes to allow us to polarize service to others towards oneness, but instead the changes created an elite instead of unity. And in 1823, Don asks, well, was Yahweh then of the Confederation? I am Ra. Yahweh was of the Confederation, but was mistaken in its attempts to aid. So, again, Yahweh had great intentions for us, really wanted to help us. It just didn't work. And in 1824, Don says, then Yahweh's communications did not help or did not create what Yahweh wished for them to create. Is this correct? I am Ra. The results of this interaction were quite mixed. Where the entities were of a vibrational sum characteristic which embraced oneness, the manipulations of Yahweh were very useful. Wherein the entities of free will had chosen a less positively oriented configuration of some total vibratory complex, those of the Orion group were able, for the first time, to make serious inroads upon the consciousness of the planetary complex. So, what Yahweh was trying to prevent, Yahweh exacerbated. But for those who were biased towards service to others, the manipulations Yahweh did were very useful, but, most of the beings on our planet are in the sinkhole of indifference, which pushes towards the negative, because that's just how our societal complex is and has been for a long time. And so they were able to establish these distortions of the elite, of the better than, of the stronger than, of the different than, and therefore what Yahweh did was a failure, according to Ra. So in 1825, Don asks, can you tell me specifically what allowed the most serious of these inroads to be made by the Orion group? I am Ra. This will be the final full question. Specifically, those who are strong, intelligent, etc., have a temptation to feel different from those who are less intelligent and less strong. This is the distorted perception of oneness with other selves. It allowed the Orion group to form the concept of the Holy War, as you may call it. This is a seriously distorted perception. There were many of these wars of a destructive nature. So these genetic changes that Yahweh made created an elite that was able to feel better than others, and then this eventually went on to create holy wars, many holy wars, based on this idea of a hierarchy of humans based upon apparent strength and intelligence. And I think it's interesting that Ra phrases it as a temptation to feel different. So if you ever have a temptation to feel different and better than others because of certain skills that you may have or certain awareness that you may have, that's a very slippery slope. We should be very careful of those types of ideas, and they're very prevalent in our social memory complex. Obviously, we live in a meritocracy. We believe that people get what they deserve in our social memory complex. So if you don't have much, if you are poor, if you're unintelligent, if you're sick or disabled, then this is, essentially what we talk about in modern terms as prosperity gospel, right? This belief that God blesses those who he loves and punishes those who have done wrong. So if you are healthy and wealthy and strong, that's because God loves you and has blessed you. And if you are sick and weak and poor, that's because you deserve it. That's your karma. And for whatever reason, you've sinned against God in one way or another, and you're being punished. And that is not how the Creator works. It's actually much more of an inversion of that, according to Ra. But again, it isn't like the Creator is just bestowing blessings on their favored people, though a fifth density negative social memory complex definitely would do that and would want people to feel that way. So yeah, avoid the temptation of wanting to feel like people's material existence is a direct line from how close they are to God. I think that's a very common subconscious belief that we carry in our social memory complex. So in 1826, Don says, "Thank you very much. I believe that to be a very important point in understanding the total workings of the Law of One. It'll be helpful. As you probably know, I must work for the next 3 days, so we will possibly have another session tonight if you think it is possible. And the next session after that would not be until 4 days from now. Do you believe another session tonight is possible?" I am Ra. The instrument is somewhat weak. This is a distortion caused by lack of vital energy. Thus, nurturing the instrument in physical balancing will allow another session. Do you understand? Questioner: Not completely. What specifically shall we do for physical balancing? I am Ra. 1. Take care with the foodstuffs. 2. Manipulate the physical complex to alleviate the distortion towards physical complex pain. 3. Encourage a certain amount of what you would call your exercise. The final injunction: to take special care with the alignments this second session so that the entity may gain as much aid as possible from the various symbols. We suggest you check these symbols most carefully. This entity is slightly misplaced from the proper configuration. Not important at this time, more important when a second session is to be scheduled. I am Ra. I leave you in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one Creator. Adonai. So Don is a pilot. Don was a pilot. That's what he did for his job. So he would be gone for days at a time when he was working. And so he wanted to get another session in tonight before he left. And Ross says you need to make sure to balance the instrument in the ways that are available to you. The first one was take care of the foodstuffs, which I think Ra is able to now talk about more because Dawn did ask about what the instrument should eat earlier in this session. It isn't something that Ra has actually talked about much, but more and more it becomes very important to Carla, her diet, what she eats to keep her balanced for these sessions. 2, manipulate the physical complex. That's giving her a massage, which is advice that Ra has given before. 3, encourage a certain amount of what you call exercise. Again, it becomes more and more of a thing for them to encourage Carla to exercise, to strengthen her body complex, to bring up her endurance, to increase her vital energy. She does have a fairly weak body, though, so she had to be careful with her exercise as well. But Ross seemed to believe that her doing a little bit of exercise would increase the potential for her vital energy. And 4, Ross says to pay attention to the alignments, that you were kind of veering into historical questions in this session. And if you have 2 sessions in a day, you need to be a lot more precise and directed with your questions and them being philosophical and more about the law of one, because otherwise Carla bears the brunt of Dawn going off topic, unfortunately. So they didn't end up, spoiler alert, they did not end up doing a second session this day. This was February 4th. Their next session was February 8th, which would be then 4 days later when Don got back from his work trip. And I personally think, especially in these early ones, it was probably better to err on the side of not doing too many. They were so excited and eager to do these sessions at the beginning. And at some point later, Rod does say that they overestimated Carla's capabilities when they okayed multiple sessions in a day. So Carla got some rest after this one. Don went and did his work, and they came back. As soon as Don got back, they did another session, and that'll be session 19. So, thank you everybody for listening to me talk about session 18 here. I think there's some really good stuff in this session, some really important things to ponder, valuable things to contemplate. And I will work on getting session 19 out as soon as I can, as always. And I'm so grateful for everyone who has been supporting the podcast. And in particular, I want to say thank you to those who have financially supported the podcast. That is so appreciated right now. I'm in a difficult place in regards to that. So every little bit helps so much. And I'm very, very grateful. So thank you very, very much. And I want to say thank you to our creator as well for giving us these experiences and allowing us to grow in our awareness and experience the thrill of that journey, because it is a lot of fun. And I will see you all next time with session 19.